This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're on the road in Portland, Oregon. We are here as part of our 100-city Silence Majority Tour. On this week, when President Obama and Republican presidential hopeful Mitt Romney debated issues of foreign policy and the economy, we turned to world-renowned political dissident, linguist, author, MIT professor Noam Chomsky. In a recent speech, Professor Chomsky examined topics largely ignored or glossed over during the campaign, from China to the Arab Spring, to global warming and the nuclear threat posed by Israel versus Iran. He spoke last month at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst at an event sponsored by the Center for Popular Economics. His talk was entitled, "Who Owns the World?"
When I was thinking about these remarks, I had two topics in mind, couldn't decide between them, actually pretty obvious ones. One topic is, what are the most important issues that we face? The second topic is, what issues are not being treated seriously or at all in the quadrennial frenzy now underway called an election. But I realized that there's no problem. It's not a hard choice. They're the same topic, and there are reasons for it, which are very significant in themselves. I'd like to return to that in a moment, but first a few words on the background, beginning with the announced title, Who Owns the World? Actually, a good answer to this was given years ago by Adam Smith, someone we're supposed to worship but not read. He was it's a little subversive when you read him sometimes. He was referring to the most powerful country in the world in his day, and of course the country that interested him, namely England. And he pointed out that in England, the principal architects of policy are those who own the country, the merchants and manufacturers in his day. And he said they make sure to design policy so that their own interests are most peculiarly attended to. Their interests are served by policy, however grievous the impact on others, including the people of England. But he was an old-fashioned conservative with moral principles, so he added the victims of England, the victims of the what he called the savage injustice of the Europeans, particularly in India. Well, he had no illusions about the owners, so to quote him again, all for ourselves and nothing for other people seems in every age of the world to have been the vile maxim of the masters of mankind. It was true then, it's true now. Britain kept its position as the dominant world power well into the 20th century, despite steady decline. By the end of World War II, dominance had shifted decisively into the hands of the upstart across the sea, the United States, by far the most powerful and wealthy society in world history. Britain could only aspire to be its junior partner, as the British Foreign Office ruefully recognized. At that point, 1945, the United States had literally half the world's wealth, incredible security, controlled the entire Western Hemisphere, both oceans, the opposite sides of both oceans. There's nothing, there has never been anything like that in history. And planners understood it. Roosevelt's planners were meeting right through the Second World War, designing the post-war world. They were quite sophisticated about it, and their plans were pretty much implemented. They wanted to make sure that the United States would control what they called a grand area, which would include routinely the entire Western Hemisphere, the entire Far East, the former British Empire, which the U.S. would be taking over, and as much of Eurasia as possible. Crucially, it's commercial and industrial centers in Western Europe. And within this region, they said, the United States should hold unquestioned power with military and economic supremacy, while ensuring the limitation of any exercise of sovereignty by states that might interfere with these global designs. And those were pretty realistic plans at the time, given the enormous disparity of power. The U.S. had been by far the richest country in the world even before the Second World War, although it was not yet the major global actor. During the Second World War, the United States gained enormously. Industrial production almost quadrupled, got us out of the Depression. And meanwhile, industrial rivals were devastated or seriously weakened. So that was an unbelievable system of power. Actually, the policies that were outlined then still hold. You can read them in government pronouncements, but the capacity to implement them has significantly declined. Actually, there's a major theme now in foreign policy discussion, journals and so on. The theme is called American decline. So, for example, in the most prestigious establishment, International Relations Journal, Foreign Affairs, a couple of months ago, there was an issue which had on the front cover in big, bold letters, "Is America over?" ? That's announcing the theme of the issue. And there's a standard corollary to this, that power is shifting to the West, to China and India, the rising world powers, which are going to be the hegemonic states of the future. Actually, I think the decline is quite real, but some serious qualifications are in order. First of all, the corollary is highly unlikely, at least in the foreseeable future. China and India are very poor countries. Just take a look at, say, the Human Development Index of the United Nations. They're way down there. China's around 90th. I think India's around 120th or so, last time I looked. And they have tremendous internal problems, demographic problems, extreme poverty, hopeless inequality, ecological problems. China's a great manufacturing center, but it's actually mostly an assembly plant. So it assembles parts and components, high technology that comes from the surrounding more advanced industrial centers, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, the United States, Europe, and basically assembles them. So say you buy one of these things, an iPad from China that's called an export from China, but the parts and components and technology come from outside. And the value added in China is minuscule. It's been calculated. They'll move up the technology ladder, but it's a hard climb. India even harder. So I think one should be skeptical about the corollary. But there's another qualification that's more serious. The decline is real, but it's not new. It's been going on since 1945. In fact, it happened very quickly. In the late 1940s, there's an event that's known here as the loss of China. China became independent. That's a loss of a huge piece of the grand area of Asia. And it became a major issue in American domestic policy. Who's responsible for the loss of China? A lot of recriminations and so on. Actually, the phrase is kind of interesting. Like, I can't lose your computer, right? Because I don't own it. I can lose my computer. Well, the phrase loss of China kind of presupposes a deeply held principle of kind of American elite consciousness. We own the world. And if some piece of it becomes independent, we've lost it. And that's a terrible loss. We got to do something about it. It's never questioned, which is interesting in itself. Well, right about the same time, around 1950, concerns developed about the loss of Southeast Asia. And that's what led the United States into the Indochina Wars, the worst atrocities of the post-war period. partly lost, partly not. A very significant event in modern history was in 1965, when in Indonesia, which was the main concern, that's the country of Southeast Asia with most of the wealth and resources, there was a military coup in Indonesia. Suharto coup. It led to an extraordinary massacre, what the New York Times called a staggering mass slaughter. It killed hundreds of thousands of people, mostly landless peasants, destroyed the only mass political party, and opened the country up to Western exploitation. Euphoria in the West was so enormous that it couldn't be contained. So in the New York Times, describing the staggering mass slaughter, it called it a gleam of light in Asia. That was a column written by James Reston, the leading liberal thinker in the Times, and the same elsewhere. Europe, Australia. It was a fantastic event. Years later, McGeorge Bundy, who was the National Security Advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, in retrospect, he pointed out that probably would have been a good idea to end the Vietnam War at that point, to pull out. Contrary to a lot of illusions, the Vietnam War was fought primarily to ensure that an independent Vietnam would not develop successfully and become a model for other countries in the region. It would not, to borrow Henry Kissinger's terminology, speaking about Chile, we have to prevent what he called the virus of independent development from spreading contagion elsewhere. That's a critical part of American foreign policy since the Second World War, Britain, France, others to a lesser degree. And by 1965, that was over. South Vietnam was virtually destroyed. The war had spread to the rest of Indochina. It wasn't going to be a model for anyone. And the contagion was contained. The Suharto regime made sure that Indonesia wouldn't be infected. And pretty soon, the U.S. had dictatorships in every country of the region. Marcos in the Philippines, a dictatorship in Thailand, Chun in South Park in South Korea. It was no problem about the infection. So that would have been a good time to end the Vietnam War, he felt. Well, that's Southeast Asia. But the decline continues. In the last 10 years, there's been a very important event, the loss of South America. For the first time in 500 years, since the conquistadors, the South American countries have begun to move towards independence and a degree of integration. The typical structure of one of the South American countries was a tiny, very rich, westernized elite, often white or mostly white, and a huge, massive, horrible poverty. Countries separated from one another, each oriented towards either Europe or more recently the United States. Last 10 years, that's been overcome significantly, beginning to integrate, the prerequisite for independence, even beginning to face some of their horrendous internal problems. That's the loss of South America. One sign is that the United States has been driven out of every single military base in South America, trying to restore a few, but right now there are none.
MIT professor Noam Chomsky. Coming up, he discusses global warming, nuclear war, and the Arab Spring in a minute.